Hello and welcome to another episode of the ADHD Goals podcast. I have a fantastic guest for you today. Her name is Barb Nangle, and she is a boundaries coach. She's a speaker, and she is also the founder of Higher Power Coaching and Consulting. And she is the host of the podcast Fragmented to Whole, which is life lessons from the 12-step recovery program. How are you doing today, Barb?
Done really well. How are you, Lawrence?
Very good. Thank you very much. Yes. It's been a little while since I've recorded an episode. It's been a few weeks. So I'm glad to have someone to sit and chat to about this topic.
Yeah.
Now, boundaries is a very big, I think it's a big issue for people with ADHD. Certainly people pleasing is one of the major saboteurs. So I think we're going to have a really exciting episode to be able to dig into talking about boundaries and people pleasing. But before we do that, I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into becoming a boundaries coach.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to start in 2015 when I was 52 and I hit a codependent bottom. And if people don't know what codependent means, welcome to the club. I didn't either.
Yeah.
So a codependent person is essentially someone who's focused on that which is outside themselves. So what is he doing? What is she doing? What are they doing? What does he need? What does she need? What does the situation need? What does the cause need? And they don't really pay attention to themselves and what's going on internally. And it was kind of shocking to me to learn about codependence because I had started therapy when I was 15. I got introduced to the whole self-help genre in my early 20s and to this day read voraciously in personal development. I've done workshops, retreats, workbooks, spiritual group support, like you name it. I've done all the things. So when I found out that I was codependent, I got into 12-step recovery first for Codependence Anonymous. And just in case people don't know what 12-step recovery is, well, if they know anything about 12-step recovery, they've probably heard of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is an alcohol recovery program. It started in the 1930s in the US, and it was the first time in history that droves of alcoholics were able to get and stay sober. And so it's a spiritual program that it got its roots from a Christian group. It's not religious at all, but it is a spiritual program. And then eventually they're now like 200 and something 12-step programs. So I got into Codependence Anonymous and very quickly felt a sense of relief. I think partly understanding that this was a thing that I had that I didn't know that explained a lot of my behaviors, partly because it was clear there's a program of recovery, there's other people like me. And really soon, I remember saying to somebody, Lawrence, I think you need to be reparented. But I didn't know that reparenting was a thing that people do. I thought I made that up. And about 6 weeks into going to Coda, I went away to go visit a friend who had been in Alcoholics Anonymous for over 10 years at that point in time. And I said, "Oh, you're going to love this. I'm going to Codependence Anonymous." And she said, "That's great. While you're here, let's see if we can find a Coda meeting and we'll go together." So she couldn't, but she found an ACA meeting, which I knew of as ACOA, Adult Children of Alcoholic. Never occurred to me that I qualified for that program, but her dad's an alcoholic and she qualifies. So I was like, I'll go for you. And when I got there, I learned it's actually called Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. Now that I qualified for. And in the opening readings of the group, one of the things they said was, we reparent ourselves. And I was like, what? Wait, that's a thing. And then they read the list of the 14 traits of an adult child. And I was shocked. Now, my friend tells me I saw the whole meeting. I don't remember that.
Mm-hmm.
I bought the literature. I came home to New Haven, Connecticut, and started going to an ACA meeting in addition to my CODA meeting. A few weeks later, an additional women's ACA meeting started. I started going to that. Then I got into a step group with 3 other women where we actively worked through the 12-step workbook in that program. And I was shocked. Like when I was reading the literature, I'd be reading it and going like, oh my God, this is what happened. This will happen. This will happen. I didn't know something, quote, happened to me, but it explained my life and my thinking and my experience in a deep and profound way that I had never experienced. And I remember thinking, were they filming the inside of my head? And so I went along in for a year in both of those programs. In CODA, I was just going to meetings. I wasn't doing anything outside. Whereas in AC, I was deeply getting into the recovery, hanging out with people in that program, working the steps, and really seeing and experiencing my own healing as well as watching it and the people around me. And about a year into it, I decided I was going to let go of CODA because it was maybe a 75% fit for me, whereas ACA was 100% fit. And that turned out to be a higher powered moment for me because one of the women that I was doing the 12 steps with in ACA had started going to Overeaters Anonymous. She had been talking about her relationship with food, specifically sugar. And I remember being like, oh my God. And it wasn't like, oh my God, what she was doing or thinking. It was that she was talking about it because that was me. And she was sort of gently trying to get me to go to Overeaters Anonymous. And so one day she invited me to go to a workshop and I was there and I'm like, oh my God, I'm a compulsive overeater. I didn't know that was a thing. I am now down over 100 pounds from my top weight, which I don't know how to translate that into kilograms. It's a lot.
Hmm.
And so I've been in Overeaters Anonymous since the spring of 2016. And so, I mentioned earlier I had done a lifetime of like therapy and personal development. And I think of all that stuff, Lawrence, as having scratched the surface of the iceberg of my life, whereas recovery melted the iceberg of my life. And there are so many reasons for that. This is one of the reasons why I started my podcast
Hmm.
because I was like, I've been trying my entire life and I got teeny tiny little bits of wisdom in all those years. Whereas recovery like taught me all this stuff about myself, even though I was always really introspective and done all this personal work, lots of stuff came out about me in recovery that I just wasn't aware of.
Hmm.
So I think of recovery as having melted the iceberg of my life. So I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, the 12 steps of recovery is an amazing technology. It's a stepwise program. It's a spiritual program and you do it with other people that are going through the same process as you. Some are at the same place as you, some are behind you, some are ahead of you. And you have people that you can like learn from and grow with and all that sort of thing. And then I also think it has to do with the trauma recovery in the
Hmm.
AC, which I just didn't know that I had. In my first 6 months in that program, I remember thinking, like, I clearly did not have it objectively as bad as the other people, but I have the traits and I didn't
Hmm.
know how I got them. And I came to understand that the absence of good things happening can result in trauma. And I was like, oh, I've later heard it said that unmet needs can result in trauma. And for me, they were primarily emotional needs. And so I stopped making excuses for why I was there. And, it really seems to be the thing that happened to me. And so, what most people think of when they think of trauma is they think of blunt trauma, like you were in a hurricane, you were attacked, you were in a war zone. What I'm talking about is often called relational trauma. I
Hmm.
think of it in my case as like the drip, drip, drip of emotional invalidation.
Yeah.
So relational trauma happens in the context of relationships over an extended period of time where needs are just not being met. So in my family, we're not doing feelings, we're not talking about feelings, we pretend things are not happening. I didn't even realize until I was well into my 50s that my parents did some gaslighting of me, which if people aren't familiar with that, it's where, they tell you things are true that are patently untrue and make you question your own reality. And it's bad enough that adults do that to adults. But when they do it to children, it's very, I want to use the word crazy making because you're trying to figure out how the world works. And
Mm.
when people are lying to you about it,
Mm.
it really distorts things for you.
Mm.
So I think of my core wound as being codependent. So the trauma resulted in codependence for me. And so I learned so many tools and skills and tips and tricks in recovery. But I think for me, learning how to build healthy boundaries was so profound because of my codependence. And I think of boundaries as the antidote to codependence. So
Mhm.
when I started in recovery, I was working at Yale University. I had been there at that point, I'd been there for 17 years. I was a program coordinator for urban education, prevention, and policy research. And when I started building boundaries, I was astonished at the ripple effect on my team. And I was like, wait a minute, none of them are in recovery. Like, what's happening?
Mm,
It just goes to show that when one person changes the dynamics of their interactions with those around them, it changes everything around them. A couple years into recovery, I ended up getting laid off from Yale, and I found my way into the world of startups, innovation, and entrepreneurship in New Haven and at Yale. And I decided to start my own business. That's when I started the podcast. And I originally just started kind of coaching and then eventually realized I needed to have a niche. And of course, it just made sense for me to become a boundaries coach. And so the way that developed is, I developed boundaries through this sort of meandering, haphazard path through the 12 steps of recovery. It's not like someone sat me down and was
mm,
like, I didn't half the time I didn't even know this was boundaries and that was what I was doing. But after I got a really good handle on boundaries and I could see they made a huge difference, I started reading about them. And when I would read about them, I would draw these images to visually depict sort of how I understood that because I'm a visual person. Well, those drawings turned into handouts, which turned into a workbook, which is the backbone of my boundaries coaching program.
mhm,
So I have a multimedia 12 module curriculum that I've basically developed an accelerated process whereby people can learn how to build boundaries in a matter of weeks through a very structured program rather than months or years through some haphazard path. My ideal clients are professional women who say yes when they really want to say no and who neglect themselves because they're so focused on others. And the reason is because that was me. I remember when I don't think I ever heard the term people pleaser until recovery. And I heard it and I was like, that's not me. Oh, yes, it is. I just didn't really understand. I remember thinking, oh, my friend Joanne, she's a people pleaser.
mhm,
I was definitely a people pleaser. And I eventually realized that. And I learned that people pleasing is dishonest and manipulative. So it's dishonest because we're saying yes to things we don't want to do. We say things we're okay with us when they're not okay. When someone says, how are you? Like, I'm fine when you're dying inside. So that's dishonest. And it's manipulative because we're going about the process of our behavior with the express purpose of pleasing others,
mm,
getting them to like us, approve us. And I remember when I learned that, I was like, oh my God, I'm a horrible person. I lie, I manipulate. And I'm not a horrible person. And if that's, you're not a horrible person either. These are patterns we developed typically when we're young, and they're survival mechanisms. They're just not serving us any longer as adults. And so, like to me, the thing that enabled me to go from 50 something years with no boundaries to having such healthy boundaries that I'm now a coach is that I now care more what I think of me than what other people do. So this
mm,
doesn't don't care at all what other people think of me. Of course I do. What it means is that I used to be willing to throw my integrity out the window and lie and manipulate for people's approval. And I'm no longer willing to do that. So I want people's approval,
yeah.
but I don't like with clause keep their approval the way that I used to, partly because I have my own approval, because I'm an honest woman of integrity, and partly because I keep the focus on me and how I want to live my life. So as I got healthy boundaries, I remember people saying, like, well, Barb, how did you know what your boundaries were? And I was like, that's a really good question. And I thought about it and I realized, well, it's based on what matters to you, like what's
Yeah.
important to you. And I sort of wish I had figured that out earlier. So when I work with my clients, Lawrence, I always start them with an exercise to determine their top 5 values so
Mhm,
they can go as guideposts or guardrails for when and where to set boundaries. And so I think of boundary building as the process of getting back into integrity with yourself, living your life in alignment with your values.
mhm,
And the number one question that I get from people about boundaries is how do I set them without guilt and shame? And I think like this talking about the values is really the key. It's not a quick fix. It's more of a long game, but it's basically focusing on yourself, living the life that really is meaningful to you and is important to you. Which, when you start doing that for yourself, you actually grow to love yourself. Like,
yeah.
I always thought I liked myself. I thought I had high self esteem. I was this positive person. And I learned in recovery I didn't love myself. I knew I didn't trust myself. And what I also saw was that I had low self-worth. So
Mm.
when I looked
Yeah.
at my past behavior of like substance use, dishonesty, dysfunctional relationships, toxic situations in workplaces, like that is not the behavior of a woman who feels worthy. And so for me, I feel worthy, I love myself, and I trust myself now. And when I look at like what was the process? Like, how did that happen? For me, it was essentially the boundary building process because I got to know like, what are the boundaries of Barb? Where do I end and other people begin? How do I give myself the kind of life that I really want to live? And if that is not loving, I don't know what is. And so those are like some of the many reasons I became a boundaries coach because I want all these things for everybody, but especially for professional women.
I think
So
it's interesting what you were saying in terms of, that discrepancy of you thinking, no, I've got high self-esteem, but when you interrogated that, you realize, no, actually, I've got a low self-esteem. And I think that becomes very apparent when with my clients, I get them to do a saboteur's test, which you can do online. And one of those is, a hyperachiever, and it sounds like, you're always achieving all the time, but in reality, you're not achieving much because you're trying to achieve all the time. But what it is that your sense of achievement comes from external. And, you might think, oh, I have high standards and, I'm a perfectionist and I can do this very well. But at the moment it gets to a point where, you feel like it's not going to be perfect, then, and you're not going to, get that external validation from somebody else, then, you shut down. And in reality, where is that sense of external validation coming from? And that's coming from a low self-esteem because you feel you're not happy enough with yourself, that you need other people's approval to show your self-worth.
yeah, but I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
That's some people are really aware.
Yeah.
Like a lot of my clients really know, like I need other people's approval. I really didn't know that. So I've got to ask, is this the positive intelligence program that you're talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I do that. I'm part
Yeah.
of that. I'm in a coaching program. I'm doing it this year for myself. Game changer. I
Yeah.
love like the little 2-minute interventions throughout the day really helps me a lot. My main saboteur is the hyperachiever, which I was
Me
shocked,
too. Yeah.
and then the avoider is my next,
Mhm.
but obviously I have many more. And interestingly, victim is not, but victim mentality was the hands down the biggest paradigm shift of my recovery. And unlike many people with victim mentality, I was never like, the woe is me, the world is against me, I can never win. My victim mentality was way more subtle than that. It was like I started to see it when I did my relationship inventory and I looked at all the men I had dated and I literally was like, well, if he would just fill in the blank, if he would just fill in the blank, like I was basically every single relationship, I had this idea, like if they just changed,
Mhm.
everything would be okay. And I was like, wait a minute, that's like me acting like I have nothing to do with the status of any of my relationships. And I started to see that was victim mentality. And then I started to realize, wait a minute, I'm like that in every relationship, work, friends, family, and so I had this if only thinking. I did a lot of blaming, even though I always thought of myself as a very optimistic, positive, motivational, inspiring person. I complained a lot. So if you're blaming and you are having if only thinking, that is evidence of victim mentality. And what that means, chances are you have it for people like have victim mentality because in some way, shape, or form, they've been victimized. And it could be just like the emotional invalidation that I was talking about before. Like, I can't do anything about this, but I always felt like a powerful woman of agency. So
Mhm.
this was all just shocking to me. And so for me, coming out of victim mentality and seeing that I was acting like life was happening to me was just, phenomenal. And I think like one of the really mundane aspects of life where it showed up very clearly was driving in
Okay.
traffic. So one of the big epiphanies that I had was I was in a traffic jam and we were just crawling. And for the third time, when I went to pump on the brakes, this thought came into my head. I need to leave more space between cars. And I was like, wait a minute. I need to leave more space between cars. I'm the problem. I got it, my program, it's working. And I started to realize, so I got to work and I sat in the car for like 10 minutes and had this cascade of like understanding and of that I'm doing this. And so like I'm the problem here. And I don't mean that in a self-deprecating way, Lawrence. I mean I'm the problem in a very empowering way because if
Hmm.
I'm the problem, I get to be the solution. And when
Hmm.
I left work that day, I was a different driver. So I stayed in the right-hand lane. We drive on the right side of the road here. So I stayed in the right-hand lane. I drove the speed limit. If someone pulled out in front of me, I either slowed down, I sped up, I swore whatever I needed to do. I didn't lose my mind and scream at them because I'm not going to give my serenity to someone else. And what I came to realize is that I had this deeply subconscious belief that there should not be traffic on the highway, especially not when I'm driving. Meanwhile, highways were built for traffic.
Mm.
If you're getting upset about there being a long line at the store or that there's all this traffic on the highway, that is you acting like you are a victim. Like that stuff is happening at you or to you. And there are lines at the store. That's how they work. There is traffic on the highway.
Does
That's
that
how.
does that go back to when you were talking before about understanding what your values are? You said, I get annoyed by there shouldn't be traffic on the highway. I've read somewhere before in terms of, what are these things in your life that you believe? And then if you interrogate them a little bit, you say, well, why is that? Is that something that's come from that values?
Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I've never thought of that as being connected to values. I think of it more as like deeply internalized limiting beliefs.
Hmm.
Like I'm a victim of traffic and
Hmm.
lines and other people and the men that I've dated. And here's something that's really ironic about that I could see, like I would think if they would just whatever, then everything would be okay. When I would talk before recovery, when I would talk with friends, men or women, about their relationships and they would complain about their partner, I would say to them, you are 50% of your relationship, which means you're 50% responsible for the status. So I could see that as being true for other people, but I
Hmm.
couldn't see it as being true for me.
Hmm.
Like, what? Like, how is that possible? Just goes to show how focused out there I was
Hmm.
and completely blind to what was going on in here. And that's another amazing gift of recovery is I can look back at my life before recovery and say, here's what I was doing, here's what I was thinking, and here's what my motives were. When at the time I was completely blind to what was going on. And it's fascinating to me that I can now go back. And what's amazing is I'm now, for the first time ever, in the only healthy romantic relationship that I've ever been in. We've been together for October was 6 years. And frequently in this relationship, I will be looking at something that like I'm participating in what's going on, but at the same time I'm observing it and I'm like, oh, this would have gone so differently before
Yeah.
recovery.
Yeah.
And I can see what I was doing to sabotage my relationships. Like I had this belief not only if he would just change, but what I realized is that I believed this is laughable that he, whoever he was, is responsible for all the bad things in the relationship. And I am responsible for all the good things in the relationship.
Hmm.
And like on the face of it, that is ridiculous. Like there's no possible way that one person is always responsible for the
Yeah.
bad thing and another person is always responsible for the good things. It's just not possible.
Yeah. I wonder, a few things have jumped out at me whilst you've been speaking about, a number of these things, and I'm going to try and pull them together. And the one thing that struck me when you mentioned earlier the name of that adult children of alcoholics, in the concept of thinking a little bit more closely about adult children and wondering whether that, I don't know if you're familiar with transactional analysis. It's a
It
basic,
sounds familiar, but I don't think
Yeah.
so.
So the reason why it's coming to mind is because basically what transactional analysis is basically in a relationship, the transaction between, communication is that you are either in one of three states. You are either the child, the parent, or an adult. And the idea is that if one person is acting like the child, it's because the other person is perhaps acting like the parent. And neither one of those is good because one is telling, in an equal relationship, one is telling the other one what to do and the other one is taking it like, they're being told what to do. Whereas what you are aiming for is to both be in the adults in the room and being able to explain and express yourself without the other person having a childish meltdown reaction.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that has anything to do with the no, it'll all fall into place. I wonder if that's anything to do with the way the process of that 12-step program within the adult children of alcoholics. It's acknowledging that you're allowing yourself to act like the child, which is victim, I suppose, rather than saying, I am an adult and I can take control and power of this situation.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I'm absolutely going to look into this because it sounds great and it's very similar to ACA recovery. So
Mhm.
in ACA, we know that we have like an inner child. Some people might have multiple inner children. And then that critical voice that we hear, we call that our inner critical parent.
Mhm.
And the task is to cultivate an inner loving parent. So I would equate the inner child to the child.
Yeah.
I would equate the parent to the critical parent. And I would equate the adult that you're talking about to the inner loving parent.
Hmm.
ACA is based on, do you know internal family systems theory?
No.
So
So,
it's a modality of therapeutic healing
hmm.
that is much broader than ACA. So the idea there is that everybody has inner parts. And we know that's true because you might say, like, well, part of me wants to go home and lay in bed, and
Yeah.
part of me wants to go out with my friend. That's real. Like that's we all have parts. But in IFS, in internal family systems theory, you have inner parts like firefighters and exiles, and you have a true self, which we would equate to the adult. And I would say ACA kind of is almost like a subset of that in terms of like how it operates. But like for me, I was in ACA for 8 years before I really got into the deep reparenting stuff. And I met, and like when I would hear other people talking, like I was like, I'm aware I have an inner child. That's about as far as it went. The only way I knew to connect was through non-dominant handwriting. I don't really understand why that works, but I also don't understand how electricity works. So I just
Yeah.
know that it does. And as I started making consistent conscious contact with my inner child, which I initially did through the non-dominant handwriting, just for the heck of it, not because something was bad or wrong, I developed this full-blown relationship. And now I have like multiple inner children and, like, I have, like, this inner family, and it may sound crazy, but it's super healing, and one of the things I've been able to do is to go back through incidents from my childhood that were traumatic and reparent myself with my inner loving parent and have them go and either protect me or explain things to me that were super confusing or completely change the interaction, and it's unbelievable the amount of healing that happens when you do that. I sort of feel like my DNA has changed.
Yeah.
I've cast my past and what it means to me. So I love this transactional analysis. I'm
Yeah.
absolutely looking into that.
Well, I think what you've touched on there, talking about your inner family, and I'm aware as we've been speaking, we've sort of leapt on different analogies for that align with different theories of different things, and but essentially what we're saying is that there are multiple parts of us inside us, and I think before we ever do any of this sort of self help or looking inside ourselves, we tend to not really see all those multiple parts, and therefore whatever things that we do that we really wish we hadn't have done or any failings that we may have had throughout our life, we sort of take ownership of all of those things and say, I'm bad and I wasn't able to do this. Whereas if we understand that there are different parts of us that may be in control at any one time, and we can identify them and put a name to them, we can say, that's my, whatever it is, it's my victim, or it's, it's my inner child, or whatever. Understanding that happened whilst they were in control. And you might be able to say, well, that's in control because I wasn't feeling I was getting this from that situation. You then have an opportunity to treat it like you're saying, reparent. Treat it like with the care that you would for your child.
Mhm.
You don't blame your child for not knowing or reacting in the way that they've reacted. You think, oh, how can I help them react better to it next time? And that is such a big change, because you can still love the child, but if you're internalizing that as saying I'm failed and I'm not good enough, then you're not giving yourself any of that self-love. And it's really hard, but that is a game changing thing, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And love is healing. It's so, so healing. And I did a bunch of work in my late 20s to clean up the negative self talk. And I thought I was good. And when I got in recovery, I realized, oh my God, I ruminate about the past. I catastrophize about the future. I complain a lot. I just replay negative stories over and over again. And I just did not know like that stuff was going on. And, one of the things I've heard it said, like when something bad happens, it was meant to happen only once. But when you replay it over and over again, when you talk about it over and over again, you're reliving it. And so if it's traumatizing, you're re-traumatizing yourself.
Mm.
Even if it's not trauma, but drama, you were only meant to go through it one time. And I just didn't know how much I was doing that. And so by doing that, it was activating my nervous system. And, we were talking before about like executive dysfunction. When you are in fight or flight mode, you can't access your frontal lobe. So you can't access the executive function. And, this makes me think of one of the things that my first 6 months in recovery, I was really having a hard time wrapping my mind around this concept of codependence. And I listened to a podcast where this woman, Tyan Dayton, was on. She is one of the pioneers in the adult child and codependency movement. She's a psychotherapist. And she said, I've been around since the whole codependency thing came around. And what's happened over time is that theory and research on trauma has advanced beyond that of codependence. And what we now know is that codependence is a result of trauma. And here's why. Because when you're traumatized, you're in fight or flight mode, which means I call it your lizard brain,
Hmm.
and you can't get to your frontal lobe. Well, your frontal lobe is where the self resides. The self is an ever changing abstract concept. And if you can't get to self, you must go outside of self. And I was like, oh. So when I heard that, it was like this giant chunk of understanding fell into place for me. Because I don't know about you, Lawrence, but I'm one of those people who I suffer from the need to understand things.
Hmm.
I don't understand something, it's very hard for me to buy into it. And that really helped me to understand like why I was codependent. And it sort of took the onus off of me of thinking like, oh, I'm a people pleaser because I'm a manipulator. It's like, oh, I'm a people pleaser because it was a safety mechanism. It was a survival trait for me that my parents to be okay with me so that I can be okay.
Hmm.
But when you're little, like I think of it like in the animal world, baby animals know if the big animals die, I'm going to die. Well, we're
Hmm.
animals. So on some level, as a child, I know I need my parents to be okay with me because I'm going to die without them.
Hmm.
Like I feel like this is like cellular knowledge. This is our bodies know this. It's not just our minds that know it. And so I've got to get them to be pleased with me. And it starts from somewhere. And when you start a behavior that young and it's so ingrained, it feels like the truth. Like the victim mentality feels like the truth of the situation.
Hmm.
It's the mentality, which means it was learned, which means it can be unlearned.
Hmm.
It doesn't feel like it. It feels like the world is happening at me or to me.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can take years to come out of that. I want to say I have 7, 8, 9 episodes about coming out of victim mentality. And the reason I have so many is because every time another layer comes up, I do a podcast about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I wonder if, just looking at like how much time we've got left, I know on your website you have a boundary building starter kit.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you might be able to tell us a little bit, as a sort of a key takeaway, what's involved in that starter kit, and what does it look like when you're sitting down and saying to yourself, right, I need to build boundaries. What does that overall process look like?
Yeah. So the boundary building starter kit is free. You can go to boundarystarterkit.com and get it. And it's a multimedia kit. So I'm going to tell you first what's in it and
Hmm.
then like what you get out of it. So it's, I think, 9 different videos. There's definitely a couple of worksheets. There's an article. And then I have over 300 episodes of my podcast, 40 something of which are about boundaries. Well, in that kit is a playlist of just the episodes on boundaries.
Yeah.
And so you get to understand like how to stop saying yes when you really want to say no, and how to focus way more on yourself than on other people, which by the way is not selfish. Like you get actually 3 modules from my curriculum, which I normally don't give away to people. So there's a mindset module. I think no matter what kind of changes you're trying to make in your life, mindset is foundational and key. There's a communications module. So what to say, how to say it. Like, so there's tips for communicating your boundaries as well as specific scripts of what to say. And then the other module I included was what I call boundaries of self containment. So these are things we need to either stop doing or contain, which for me, Lawrence, were hands down the most impactful boundaries. So, a couple examples. Something I need to stop doing is the inner critic. So,
Yeah.
as I realize that's going on, I call it changing the channel. I go from negative Nancy to like positive Patty kind of channel.
Hmm.
Like, if I'm saying negative, you can't have a positive life with a negative mind. So that's one boundary of self-containment that really only affects me. Other people don't know that I'm doing it. A boundary of self-containment that not only affects me, but also affects other people is gossip. So I didn't even know that I gossiped. Meanwhile, I was talking negatively about my boss behind her back for 19 years. That's kind of the definition of gossip. But I didn't understand that. And what I did was because I was there longer than everybody else and I had more authority than everybody but her, I created this culture of expectation where we talk about problems, not solutions. We
Hmm.
blame her and we sit around waiting for her to change, even though she's been the same for 19 years. She's not changing, and we're not stepping in and taking responsibility for things that we could if we stopped waiting for her to change.
Yeah.
And so that had a profound effect on my life. So those are the 3 modules that are included in that. Well, there's a ton of stuff, but I think, the most important thing is to like understand what matters to you. And then, like, believing you deserve to set boundaries. So there's a couple like, one mindset thing in particular that I wanna share here that has really helped me a lot. It's this phrase, "info, not ammo." I heard it on a recovery podcast, and the idea is when you see something about yourself that you don't particularly like, this is information for you to learn, integrate, and grow from. It is not
Mm.
ammunition to beat yourself up, because beating yourself up ends up in you being battered and bruised, and that is no place from which to grow and change. But when you use it as info, in other words, you're being curious. And I love curiosity because it's neutral. So what you're doing when you think info, not ammo, is you're going from self-judgment to self-compassion. And the bridge to get from self-judgment to self-compassion is curiosity. So, like for me, it might be, okay, what's my part here? What have I been doing? Well, I've been in these relationships thinking that they're responsible for all the bad things and I'm responsible for all the good things. So it's not going to help me to beat myself up about that. It's going to help me to start seeing like, okay, what was I doing? And it's something that unfolds over time. The other thing about this phrase, info, not ammo, I also recommend you use it for other people. So if you have a person that you have this ongoing dynamic that's really difficult for you, I encourage you to look at the situation as info, not ammo. So let's be curious. So it could be, why do I think they're doing that? That might not be so fruitful. The more important question is, what could I do differently?
Mm.
So my boss, I kept expecting her to be reliable, to show up on time and do what she said she was going to do and follow through. She was never going to do that. So what can I do differently? Well, one, I could stop making excuses for her and covering up for her. So I did. And I just let, like, when people would say, "Where is she?" I'd be like, "I don't know.
Mm.
Where's her phone number?" Like, I'm not going to cover for her. I'm not going to go chasing her down for you. When if there was something that only she could do, I wouldn't hound her to do it. It would just not get done if she didn't do it. And then she, as the boss, would have the repercussions of not getting it done. But there were things that I could take responsibility for that I did instead of waiting. And I got together a smaller team of people and we started having weekly touch base meetings to keep the communication among the administrative staff flowing rather than waiting for her and blaming her that the
Mhm.
communication wasn't flowing.
Mm.
So I started to take responsibility for things that I could take responsibility for. And so this leads me to another insight that I had is that I had a lot of wildly unrealistic expectations of myself, other people, and the world. And so, like in my situation, I was working at Yale University for this incredibly accomplished, talented woman. And so I think in that case, it's reasonable to expect, especially in a professional setting, that a person is going to do what they say they're going to do. They're going to follow through and they're going to show up. That's a reasonable expectation. But for that particular woman, it
Mhm.
was realistic
Mhm.
because I 19 years of evidence that she wasn't going to. So it's reasonable to expect professionals to act that way, but it might be unrealistic for a particular individual because they've given you evidence. So if you want to continue to be upset that they're the way that they are and have been since the day you met them, go ahead and do that. You're going to have a miserable life.
Mm.
I blamed her. And now I'm like, oh, my part was expecting her to be different than she was.
Yeah. I absolutely love that phrase, info, not ammo,
I know, the
because
game changer.
I think, you know, whenever I think about, I, I I call it, the chimp brain, which is essentially, in fight, flight, or freeze mode. And that can be responsible for a lot of the executive dysfunction within ADHD. But if you talk about ammunition, then if you're going to use that ammunition on yourself, then you're automatically putting yourself in, a defensive mode. Somebody's coming at you to fight you. It might be you, but you're putting yourself into a mode that is going to be in fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so, but the opposite is when somebody comes to you and is curious and say, "Hey, oh, that's interesting. What could we do?" Then you're like instantly in the other, the human brain, which is like, "Yeah, I can be curious. And how can I solve this problem?" It's really a great phrase. I wonder something else you said in terms of, you got scripts to, what to say. And I wonder, I think a big part of people pleasing is just instinctively saying yes and then not giving yourself the time to think. And so what are some of those, those key phrases that people might be able to use?
Yeah. So pausing is my number one tool of recovery. And I remember when I was told that pausing, and the effects of it, I was like, great idea. I have no idea how to do it.
Mm.
So it's one of those things that you'll learn over time. You'll realize like what happened for me is I was like, oh, that thing 2 weeks ago, I could have paused. Noted. That thing a week ago, I could have paused. And I was like, oh my God, pretty soon I'm going to be able to actually remember to pause. So pausing is allowing yourself to like breathe and rest. And I think of it as coming out of a lizard brain and using my executive function. So there are quite a number of phrases you can use. Like what I tell my clients is for the next week, every time someone has to do something, I don't care what it is, you're going to say, let me think about it. Let me get
Yeah.
back to you.
Yeah.
Right? Just for a week, do it as an intervention for yourself to just disrupt the whole thing. So saying things like, let me think about it. I'm going to have to get back to you. I'm not sure. You might even say, oh my God, I'd love to. I have to check my schedule. Or if you have another person involved, like, I need to check in with my partner, but things like that, just automatically pausing. And I think like a huge problem for people when one of the reasons they don't want to say no to people is because they don't want to hurt people's feelings.
Hmm.
Well, I want to say a couple of things about that. Number one, you get to be included in the people whose feelings you don't want to hurt.
Hmm.
Okay. So let's keep that in mind. But there's a difference between harming someone and hurting someone. So I'll give you an illustration. It might hurt you to use a needle to take a splinter out of your finger, but it's not going to harm you. In
Hmm.
fact, it's going to heal you. It might hurt someone's feelings to set a boundary with them, but it's not going to harm them. In fact, it might heal the relationship. because you're coming clean with them and telling them the truth
Hmm.
about what's okay and not okay. Now, that might not happen. There are some people who get very upset, but at minimum, it's going to heal your relationship with yourself because you're showing up for yourself and following through for yourself in a way you probably never did before. So when you're saying no to people, you're saying yes to you, and
Hmm.
you get to be included in the people who you want to please. And you get to be included in the people whose feelings you don't want to hurt.
Yeah.
So, like, you count, you matter. And that's the thing is when we're so practiced at saying yes, we don't even consider ourselves.
Yeah. I think, looking at that scenario, I mean, you can look at what the worst case scenario would be. You think is you're going to hurt their feelings, but you can easily look at where, people may have used a pause with you, or told you that they were, they couldn't do it. And you actually feel like respect for them because, like, oh, well, okay.
So,
And also I know where I stand with them. And,
yes.
and,
Yes.
and but the other worst case scenario is, which is worse than, you feeling you're going to hurt their feelings, is what happens when you don't actually meet their expectations and you don't do the thing that they wanted you to
And
do.
then you beat yourself up and they're
Yeah.
mad at you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think if, and like an indicator that we probably need a boundary or need to shore up a boundary is we get resentful. So that was me. I was like a volunteeraholic and I said yes all the time. Then I'd be like, I can't believe she just asked me for the 50th time to blah, blah, blah. Well, she asked me 50 times because I said yes 49 times.
Yeah.
And so, like, a lot of times people will say, so and so took advantage of me. No, you gave them the advantage. They did not take advantage of you. People can't walk all over you unless you're lying on the floor.
Yeah. I was speaking with someone recently about, you know, their relationship, or what they feel when they feel like they're being micromanaged. And it comes from, they were saying, it's because they don't, why I'm getting upset because I feel like they don't think that I can do it. That's why they're asking me, or explaining to me. It's like, you don't trust me to be able to do it. But, you probably, if we were to look through this lens of, did you set some boundaries before you got into this situation where you're being micromanaged? Is like, maybe if you'd have set a boundary, you know, you wouldn't be in this situation where they would be asking you over and over again.
Yeah. Right. So when you set boundaries with people, you're giving them expectations. This is how you can expect to interact with me. And I love this. I heard this last year. If you want the best of me, and that's what I want you to get the best of me, you deserve that, then you're going to XYZ. Here's my boundary.
Hmm.
Well, give me 24 hours notice, knock on my door before you come in, not request things, well, like whatever the boundary is. And just speaking of that, I want to just say, like, to me, a boundary is a standard that you have for your life. And then there are limits that you put on yourself and other people to help you uphold those standards.
Hmm.
So I'm not a fan of people using the word boundaries when they're setting boundaries because there's lots of myths and misconceptions
Yeah.
about that. But an example of this standards would be, I have pretty high standards for my health now because of all my years of like substance use and overeating and toxic situations and relationships. So a limit I have for myself, I mean, I have many, but one is I don't stay up past 11:30 at night
Hmm.
anymore because sound sleep is really important foundation for health. And so I don't stay up all night watching television or going through social media or whatever. And then a limit I have for other people is you can't smoke in my house because this is a healthy home.
Hmm.
So that's a really easy example of here's the standard and then here are the limits for me and other people that help
Hmm.
me uphold them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Barb. I think that's it. We probably should wrap it up there, but I think that's been a fascinating conversation about boundaries, and I think it's given. I mean, there's been lots of little turns of phrase that we've used, which are really good nuggets to remember in the moment. And just to remind the listeners, if they'd like to go to your website and download that
Mhm.
starter kit, could you just remind them again where they can find that?
Yeah, they can go to boundariesstarterkit.com.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to that in the show note. in the show notes. Okay, well, thank you so much, Barb. It's
Thank
been a
you.
fascinating conversation.
Absolutely.
I think we probably could have talked for another hour on
I
about
agree.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we could have. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
it's been a pleasure.
Well,
Well, there we have it. Thank you so much for listening this far. If you want to hear more episodes, then please subscribe on YouTube or whatever podcast platform you use. It really helps to spread the word. So if you know anyone this episode could help, then please share it with your friends. If you want to follow me on social media, I am on Instagram at ADHD_goals, and you can find me on Facebook too. If you want to get in touch with the show, then you can email me at hello@adhdgoals.co. And finally, if you're struggling to manage your ADHD and you would like me to be your coach, then please head over to my website and get in touch. Until next time, bye for now.